Is it nighttime there?
It is. It's 9 o'clock. Yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes I do them at usually at 9 or 10 on a weekend. Hello, everybody. We're live now. I'm here with the Keith Preston. And I'm going to grill him about his thoughts because last time we talked, when was that? Was it a year ago? I don't know.
Probably longer. Yeah.
2 years or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
And you were, I remember you were talking a lot about the lead up to what you felt was likely to happen, and there was talk of war with Iran, and now all that's come to pass. So I wanted to see. I do enjoy your assessment of things, and I wanted to ask you about all that, how you feel about how it played out, and I guess what you just like last time. I wanted to see what your prediction would be, or how just generally the whole scene is such a mess. I mean, as well as other stuff. Like I said before we went live, I was going to ask him about what he thinks of Noam Chomsky now. Keith being famous as an anarchist. And anyways, I want to ask him all these things. But we were just talking there just before going live about Keith was talking about Bertrand Russell, and I was saying and comparing him to Nietzsche and how he still likes elements of both, and he doesn't completely or wholly reject or accept any of it. And I thought, well, that's a truly anarchist view to as you view everything in that way. I guess like even your philosophy is anarchist, but there's certainly a lot of truth in that so many people have it in a black and white fashion where they must fully reject somebody if they disagree with something or this and that. Like with everybody ever, you're going to have some disagreements, and you just have to take the good and kind of sometimes there's more bad than good, and then you can reject them, I guess. Too much black and white thinking. Anyways, yeah. Hello hello Keith, how's it going?
I'm good. Good to be back on the program.
I also didn't know you mentioned there you had a fundamentalist religious upbringing. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm from a place called Lynchburg, Virginia, and I haven't lived there in about 40 years, but I did grow up there. I was there when I was a child and a teenager. And that area is most well known for being the headquarters of the Falwell family's televangelism empire. And then they've got their university, Liberty University. In fact, Falwell Sr., Jerry Falwell Sr., he died probably about 20 years ago, but he was actually a friend of my parents. Yeah, he was a friend of my parents. He and my father were roughly the same age. But Jerry was maybe a few years older, and they went to the same high school. They were from the same neighborhood in the Lynchburg area. And when my parents were married, Jerry was actually the pastor that officiated the ceremony. This was long before Jerry was famous. He was just a dude that had a local church and a garage or something. Yeah, but I mean that my family history with the Falwell family goes way back.
No way, that's interesting. Yeah, and what do you think? Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, I grew up in two different types of Christian fundamentalism at the same time. I went to a private school that was run by the Independent Fundamental Baptist, a church that they had. And it wasn't the Falwell organization, but it was the same type of group. There were a lot of those kinds of groups in the area I grew up in. So I did that for about 10 years up until I was about 14. And then the church that I grew up in was a Van Tillian Calvinist church, the Orthodox Presbyterian church. And over time, it became a Christian Reconstructionist church, which is like a Rushdoonyite church. And again, I put that behind me when I was about 14 or 15 as well. But that's how I spent the first, 15 years of my life or so. Was kind of submerged in all of that. And then I went in a totally opposite direction.
Opposite as in atheism or Satanism or
both at various points. I was one of those 80s loser teenage Satanists. I was one of those guys. I never killed anybody or poked their eyes out or anything like that, But I fancied myself a Satanist when I was a teenager. And then later I got more into atheism. In fact, we were talking about Bertrand Russell and Nietzsche. That's how I got into that. I was interested in the atheist philosophers, from different perspectives. And then over time I started getting into politics and that kind of stuff as well. But, all of that was a good while back. I mean, we're talking about 40 years now. So, but that's how it began.
And how did your parents take to your rejection of the faith? That's okay.
Well, they didn't like it. They still don't. I mean, they're both still around. They're about 90
Oh,
now. But,
all right, okay.
they still don't really like it. But,
They must be happy. They must be overjoyed you're not still a Satanist. I mean, that part must have sucked for them.
Well, when I turned 50, my mother actually sent me a letter saying, I'm really surprised you made it this far. I didn't think you would. So.
And Jerry Falwell, so he got famous when he went on TV and became a televangelist.
Right.
Somehow.
Yeah, he was one of the pioneers.
Yeah, he was, wasn't he? Like even
he was, yeah.
Who's first? Like him or Billy Graham is first, right? Who was the first one?
Yeah, Billy Graham didn't have a regular TV show. He used to do these televised crusades. But yeah, it was Jerry Falwell, Oral Roberts, Rex Humbard.
Oral Roberts, I remember him. Of all names, Oral. I've never.
Pat Robertson. There was a number of those guys that started off when television became a thing, and then they created these TV ministries, I guess in the 60s and 70s. But right, of course, that kind of stuff was huge for a time.
There is a theory going around. I don't know if you've heard this, that a lot of the a lot of money went into televangelism for the purpose of creating Christian Zionists. Have you heard this kind of thing?
Oh yeah, totally.
You believe it? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just on a program where I was talking about that. I was on Todd Lewis's program early today, Praise the Folly, talking about that. We were talking about Christian Zionism. That was actually the theme of the show. But Christian Zionism is interesting because it's not a part of ancient or historic Christianity. Now, you do see prototypes for it, or things that could be considered prototypes. Like in ancient Christianity, you had some Jewish Christian groups who thought you had to convert to Judaism to be a Christian. There was groups like the Ebionites. And then in the early modern era, like around the time of the Reformation, you had some Protestant groups that were sort of like proto-Christian Zionists. They thought that the Jews would someday regather in Israel or whatever. Calvin kind of had ideas like that. But opinions of that type generally were on the fringes of early Protestantism as well. It's not until the 19th century that what we think of as Christian Zionism becomes a thing. Now, the originator of that was an Anglican priest. He was Irish, but he was in the Irish section of the Anglican Church.
It was landed gentry Irish. Is that it? Yeah, Church of England Irish.
Yeah, it was a guy named John Nelson Darby. He wasn't really a Christian Zionist in the sense that we would think of it today, but he was sort of set that in motion, based on some of his ideas of Bible prophecy and that kind of stuff. Yeah. There was a guy named Cyrus Scofield, an American in the 19th century, who
famous for the Bible.
Yeah, well, for what we know about him, he seems to have been basically just a con man. But he went to jail for fraud at one point, and apparently he was an alcoholic. He just had a person of low character, I guess would be the.
And how much of this is he responsible for inventing then with his Bible? If he's just sort of like an L. Ron Hubbard kind of
extremely influential. He created a version of the Bible that was annotated, where he basically annotated the Bible to give his interpretation. Some of which was stuff he lifted from guys like Darby. The thing about 19th century American religious culture is that during that time you had all of these strange sectarian groups emerge that were offshoots of Protestantism. They weren't really Protestant in the traditional sense, but they kind of took Protestant Christianity and gave it their own spin. The Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, the New Thought. That's basically what Joel Osteen is New Thought. The Christian Science, the Seventh-day Adventists. There was a lot of that kind of stuff. And Christian Zionism came out of that milieu as well. One of the Catholic criticisms of Protestantism is that once you eliminate the authority of the church and you just rely on sola scriptura, then just everybody becomes his own church, and then you start getting all these weird cults. And they turned out the Catholic point of view was correct in that sense. But but that's so Christian Zionism starts to develop as a theological movement in the 19th century through the influence
Right.
of this guy. And initially, it seems to have been popular with a lot of the holy roller types, the kind of slain in the spirit, tongue speakers and that kind of stuff. And then it finds its way into a lot of the Baptist denominations. It's typically the non-denominational churches, or the churches that are extremely internally decentralized, where basically each church just does its own thing. You don't find as much of this in the high churches, like the churches that have an established hierarchy, and they're more traditional, like the Anglicans and the Episcopalians and the Lutherans and United Methodists. This kind of stuff is most popular in the low churches and in the very non-denominational or localized churches, because a lot of those come out of the Baptist tradition, even if they don't identify as Baptists anymore.
But is talking in tongues is talking in tongues a Baptist tradition?
No, that you find more of that in the theological term of that is the charismatics. But you find that in the Pentecostal, apostolic, holiness, some non-denominational churches practice that as well. There may be some Baptists that get into that somewhere, but that's not generally what Baptists do.
Because I remember I remember seeing that for the first time. I had friends where I grew up in Canada, and the only sort of people like what you're describing. I know there's much more in America, but up there was a kind of a local culty thing called Living Waters Faith Fellowship or something. And I had friends whose parents would want you to come to church with them, and I did go once, and I saw this talking in tongues thing, and I thought, okay, this is incredibly schizophrenic. This is not for me. I couldn't believe they were doing
a lot of these kinds of churches are those types of churches. They have this. They usually have some weird name, and they're not a part of any larger denomination, or if they are, it's just some very loose affiliation. It's very low church. It's a very low church evangelical.
Low church. I think it might have been associated with the Billy Graham, actually, if I think about it now. Something to do with him.
Billy Graham wasn't a charismatic. He wasn't into the tongue speakers, although he had an appeal though that was across denominations.
Okay.
He came out of a Baptist tradition, I think, but he wasn't really that per se. His outlook was very Baptistic in many ways, at least early on. Over time, he seems to have become closer to a mainline Protestant, but and he even had a positive relationship with Catholics as well. But
did he?
Yeah.
Is he the one who's on the tapes for talking to Nixon in a very anti-Semitic way? Is it him?
Yep, that's him. That's him.
Yeah. Okay, so he wasn't a Christian Zionist then, or maybe not exactly.
Well, he kind of predates that. I don't know specifically what his views on that were. I know his son is a Christian Zionist. Of what particular type, I'm not sure, but Christian Zionism starts to really take off in the 70s, I guess, in the United States. And Billy Graham was already a well-established figure by then. But in the 70s in the United States, we had a proliferation of a lot of weird religious movements. And I think that coincided with all of the cultural upheavals that happened in the 60s and 70s, the Cultural Revolution of that time. And, we had a proliferation of a lot of strange cults like the Scientologists and the Hare Krishna and this cult that Tulsi Gabbard belongs to, Science of Identity. That's a splinter from the Hare Krishnas. But you had a lot of these. Yeah. And you had a lot of these evangelical Protestant fundamentalist groups expand a lot during that time. And a lot of those started to develop Christian Zionism as an outlook. There was a writer by the name of Hal Lindsey, who was a popular, he wrote pulp theology, I guess, like he wrote these theological books about the end times and the return of Jesus Christ and Armageddon. But he wasn't a real theologian, of any reputable type. He was just he was like a televangelist, only he wrote books.
Pulp theology. So he wrote it in story format, is it?
Yeah,
I,
kind of. I mean, it might as well have been. But no, they used to make movies about the end times and the
okay, well,
Antichrist.
was that in like was he making any movies in even the 80s and 90s?
Well, there were movies called the Left Behind, the Left Behind novels, and there's a film about that. That's Tim LaHaye that was behind
Is
that.
that
He was
is it a film with the guy from the X-Files? Is that you know
I'm
the
not
guy?
sure. I don't
Because I
know.
saw a film. I saw the oddest film. One of the oddest films I've ever seen. It sounds like maybe it could be one of these when I was a kid, and I haven't seen it since. But it starts out. You think it's like a sex movie, you think it's like one of these titillating, almost Eurotrash, soft porny things. It's just about this couple of swingers having sex. And one day they're having sex, and the guy sees a tattoo of the Virgin Mary on the back of the woman he's having sex with. And then they decide to become ardent, born again Christians. This is after the first half.
Okay, I know what film you're talking about. Yeah, but
Okay.
that's not a Christian film. That's just a regular.
Well, then in the end, the rapture comes real, so it had kind of a Christian
Yeah,
message in the
I
end.
know, I know. Yeah, I know what film you're talking about.
Okay.
Doesn't that have Mimi Rogers in it? Tom Cruise's ex-wife. I think she's in it.
I don't. Maybe,
It-
yeah. All I remember is the guy from the X-Files because it was. I haven't seen it since. We're talking about a movie I haven't seen since I was a teenager, probably.
Yeah, well, there was a film about.
Sorry?
There was an actual Christian film about the return of Jesus Christ or the rapture or the Antichrist and all that stuff.
Yeah.
In the 70s, it was called A Thief in the Night.
Okay.
Excuse me. When I was a kid in school, we used to actually watch this in our religion classes. This was considered like textbook material.
Yeah.
I mean, even at that age, it just seemed nonsensical. I mean, to me, it just seemed like, Star Wars or something. I was like, in fact, I saw it around the time that the first Star Wars film came out, and they seemed basically interchangeable. It's just.
And to you, did it strike you as fictional at the time, or were you a true believer at that time?
Well, no, here's the thing. I grew up with all the standard Christian beliefs that people from these subcultures have. But the church that I went to was not a Christian Zionist church, and they didn't believe in dispensationalism. My school was that, but my church was a Calvinist church. I remember, in fact, asking my parents about that film when I saw it. I was about 10 at the time, and 9 maybe, something like that. And I remember asking my parents about it, and they said, "Oh, don't worry about that. Our church doesn't believe that. Yeah, your school believes that, but we don't believe that." So so I was like, "All right, whatever." So then I'd start picking on other kids in school, like because they were really into that film, and I'd say, that film's wrong." It's like they're like, "You can't say that. That's Jesus is going to be pissed." But
John Doris says
churches already. Because I was a Calvinist, though, I went to a Baptist school. And my schoolmates thought my religion was crazy. I mean, I was considered an extremist even then.
Is that how it is between? I always thought the Protestant groups, the different ones, kind of got along pretty well. But is that how it is? They really do.
Well, they get along somewhat. I mean, they're not going to take up arms against each other.
They don't think you're going to go to hell, or do they? I don't know. Like,
well, it depends.
I mean, I know there's the crazy ones like the Westboro Baptists and the. Is that what they're called?
Well, no, the Westboro Baptist Church was like they were in a category by themselves. I mean, that's a true cult. I mean, that's like Charles Manson or something. But now, in my circle, the Baptists and the Calvinists tolerated each other, and they thought, we'll probably see each other in heaven. But even though you get this and this and this and this and this wrong, it's like
right. So it's all very specific and like down to the letter, and examine this, and I have this on you. Right. It is like that. Is it? Have you found yourself returning to any? Have you returned to any of this belief at all now that you're getting older, or how do you feel about? No, you don't think you will. No,
I'm more atheist than I've ever been. I'm not only an atheist. I'm basically a mythicist in the sense that I'm a mythicist. I'm very influenced by thinkers like Dr. Robert Price or Richard Carrier in the sense that I think that there are solid arguments for the viewpoint that not only Jesus Christ, but also Saul of Tarsus or the Apostle Paul, that these are fictional characters, that they never really existed. I'm sort of like a biblical minimalist. Like among Bible scholars, you have maximalists who say that I mean, obviously you have like the fundamentalists, biblical inerrantists. It's the word of God. But you have
Yeah.
biblical maximalists, and they, whatever they believe about theology, they'll say, well, the Bible's mostly true. It's just plus some mythology and literary embellishments and that kind of stuff. And then you
Yeah.
have the minimalists who say, well, the Bible is mostly just fiction. It's just a storybook. And that's more the direction or collection of storybooks. And that's kind of the direction I live in, I'll move in.
Right. Now that's interesting. Yeah. I myself am not, I've never been inspired by anything to do with the Bible, and more I'm of the opinion it's basically like a foreign paganism of a different people. And
well, what I consider it to be, I consider the Christianity, I consider the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Jewish Hebrew Bible, and the Christian Old Testament. That is a synthesis of pre-existing religious currents. I mean, it's borrowings from predominantly Canaanite, Egyptian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Sumerian, Persian religion, Greek, Phoenician. You can find traces of all of that in the Tanakh through textual analysis and literary analysis and linguistic analysis, and then that's it's supported by archaeological findings and all that as well.
Yeah.
The only thing from the Old Testament that we can really verify for sure from history is that we do know there was an ancient Hebrew civilization. We do know they had two kingdoms, the Judahites and the Israelites. We don't know how they got that way. We don't know.
I thought they actually knew that, for instance, David was actually a king and all that kind of thing. Is that true? Is that known or not? I don't know.
Maybe. The only historical evidence for the existence of King David outside the Bible is a single inscription that was found in 1993. It's called the Teldon Stele, and it's from another ethno-cultural group. I forget which one, but it's an inscription in their language from the ancient Near East, from the Levantine region, that mentions the House of David. Yeah, they mentioned going to war with the House of David. We're not sure about the translation. Like, we don't know if House of David is exactly the correct translation. Also, we don't know if it's our David.
So that could all be invented too. Yeah, the whole thing
is it could be that we don't even know if it's referring to a rival kingdom or house, or whether it's referring to a god.
So that's one of the questions. That's why the Christians are all like, "Oh, pagan larpers and all this," but like, the Bible is just as larpy, and if not even more so. In its original, in the Old Testament, for sure. I know the New Testament is something else, but even in the New Testament, I don't find it to be particularly philosophical or observational. It's just sort of, again, more kind of do this or else talk. But that's my view on it. We shouldn't talk about. Let's just talk about this a little bit longer before we get on to the actual topic. You've so much information, and it's so fascinating to me. I can't help but listen to it all. But sorry, go on. Say your bit. I was going
to say, yes, all we know about the Tanakh that we can verify from actual history and archaeology and all of that is we do know they had the two kingdoms. We can verify the kings associated with the Amorite dynasty as kings of Israel. There is confirmation of that.
Okay.
We can some of the Judahite kings, most notably Hezekiah. We can identify that from history. Okay. And we know that they had a religion built up around the temple worship of a god they called Yahweh. It looks like the god Yahweh was originally an Edomite or maybe a Midianite god that somehow found its way into the Canaanite pantheon as a storm god, and like one of the sons of El, or the brother of Baal, and somehow that became the Hebrew national god. So that's the Old Testament of the Tanakh.
Yeah, and this should be so widely believed with so little actual evidence, other than
even Jesus Christ. The only real evidence we have about him external to the Christian, the canon itself, the Christian canon, New Testament, and then some non-canonical surviving Christian writings. We have a reference to him in Josephus that was supposedly written about 60 years later. Some scholars think it's not original, that it's a Christian forgery, which I think it probably was. And then there's references to the Christians as a sect or religion in Tacitus and in
Yeah.
Pliny the Younger, and some other.
I'm pretty sure in Tacitus they're mentioned mostly for like how the crucifixes lit up the night because they lit them on fire too.
Well,
Not,
it's negative. It's definitely a negative reference. Although the
Yeah.
Tacitus passage, we're not sure about that either. We're not sure if that passage was originally referring to Jesus, the Jesus of Christianity, or not, but maybe.
Right. Oh, I didn't even think he mentioned Jesus. I thought he was complaining about Christians generally, but I can't remember.
Well,
It's been a long time
Christians.
since I read them.
I think he mentions. I forget the exact wording, but it's something about the Christians, a miserable superstition. I think he says they worshipped Jesus, who had been crucified under Tiberius, and we're not sure if that passage is authentic though. But yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, I didn't know that. Right. Okay, I missed. That's. I must have forgotten or missed that. It's been a long time since I read Tacitus as well. Everything I read I did so long ago. I'm just an aging Hulk now, just carrying snippets of the information. I absorb I've never been good for remembering exact lines or dates and things, but I think I'm good at absorbing the overall idea, like the themes, and I just keep that with me or something. But then often people bring up points and things that is explicitly said in Plato and so forth, even though I call myself like a Platonist, and then I'm like, I don't remember that. I just remember the overall idea that I got from it, I guess.
Well, there was an ancient cult of Plato as well. Like Plato's nephew led a cult that claimed Plato was the son of the god Apollo. And in fact, some people think that Christianity was derived in part from the Platonic cult.
I do think so. And all the best parts of it really were taken from Platonism, as far as I can see, and grafted into it afterwards. I mean, whenever people are making the theological arguments, intelligent ones, it's nothing ever specific to the text and the stuff in the Bible. It's more just the kind of loose Platonism, the ideas that Aquinas applied to it, etc. It's really mostly just Platonist notions that they said, oh, this obviously means this, and sort of association and metaphor and stuff.
Right.
So I always just find that a bit. Why not just go to the source if that's the way? And also, I think like even yourself as a man, Preston, as an obviously Anglo-Saxon background. Would you not the Jews have their religion still that pertains to them in their bloodlines, right? That links them into their past. Shouldn't we also? I know I'm making my pagan arguments here, but wouldn't it be great if
my ancestry is mixed? The name Preston is English, Anglo-Saxon, although it may have been initially Frankish. It may have been. I had an aunt that was really into that kind of stuff, and she claimed that my family name had its roots among the Frankish Goths who migrated to the British Isles, and that the name became anglicized or Anglo-Saxonized, or however that would work. And originally, apparently, the name was spelled with the E on the end, Presto, like the antifreeze, So that's what she always called it. Yeah, but no, my ancestry is English, Irish, Scottish, French, German, Cherokee, and probably Shawnee or Monacan, some of the Native American tribes from the western part of Virginia, some of which are now extinct. So yeah, I mean, I'm about 8 different nationalities, I guess.
Well, that's still. It doesn't mean it's still. You can still link yourself to more home.
Well, I have ancestry that go back to colonial Virginia, like the Patrick Henry, one of the founding fathers of the United States. He's one of my ancestors.
Right. Well, I didn't mean that you have to adhere to strictly Anglo-Saxon mythical history, religion, or anything like that. But yeah, I just think, generally speaking, there is there is homegrown European myth you can base everything on, and it has it's very similar to what you find in Christianity. But again, this is totally off topic. I don't want to be. I'm always ranting about this shit. I can't help it. I can't help myself.
Right.
But you want to say John Gora said that Nick Cage was in a Left Behind movie. I don't know. Okay, so that's one of them. I'll have to look out for it. And he also says Gary Busey did a Left Behind movie, or an End of Days Jesus film. So whatever. Those are a Nick Cage Left Behind movie. I have to see this. Is Nick Cage a born again guy or I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I think Gary Busey was into that scene for a while. But I don't know.
Oh, he's fucking nuts, that guy.
Yeah.
And the Rick D says some say Socrates is a myth. Well, it doesn't matter if he's a myth. I'm pretty sure he's real because he's mentioned as much as you can believe or have to believe ancient history, especially Greek history. which is proven correct time and time again. Like Herodotus, all of them. It seems like when a lot of things that were in doubt end up being proven. He's mentioned by more than one, more than just Plato.
Yeah,
but I guess he could
we
be.
have more evidence for Socrates than we do for some of the biblical characters. Yeah,
Yeah, we have a bust of his likeness, even or several, I think. So
yeah.
I mean, you can say that about anybody in the ancient history, I guess. But yeah, I'm pretty sure he's a real guy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just think that a big part of religion should be and is, as certain people still, well, only really the Jews, these Jews and pagans, that should link you to your genetic past, and that it is a big part of the reason for it is to kind of safeguard that, or at least give it an identity, a proper one.
Right.
But anyways, this is the pagan argument, I guess. But like as an atheist, I'm sure it's hard to just like leap into paganism. But then a lot of it is just sort of Nietzschean in a way, where you sort of recognize the ritual and you choose, if you're going to use a background myth for your morality, you may as well use the Orphic, or not the Orphic, the Delphic maxims and the fucking Poetic Eddas. Anyways, let's leave all that behind, because holy shit,
we're left behind.
Let's leave behind the religious topic that is not meant to be the topic. So, what do you think about the recent events and our old buddy Trump? And as I saw, I didn't get to read it or see it, but I saw on your Substack, I love the title of it, and I sort of stole it for this. What was the one I saw on yours? Is Trump going to be fired as CEO of? Was it globalism or something? I think I remember what it was. But I was like, what's this all about?
Incorporated or something? Yeah, that's from an episode of Praise of Folly. But well, my take on that is that if we look at the history of the last few decades, we see after the end of the Cold War, the United States emerged as this unipolar power. And out of that, we get, globalization and neoliberalism and neoconism and the war on terrorism and all of this kind of stuff. And my view is that era is now fading, right? And the era of unipolar American hegemony is fading. And if there was an interesting book that was published back in 1999, 99 or 2000, by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. And these were two writers from the far left, basically Marxists. And they argued that a world empire had emerged that was sort of a system of global capitalism, of which the United States played the role of a world monarch, sort of like the United States is like the boss of world capitalism. And I think that was a fairly solid analysis for that time period. But nowadays, I think we're moving into something that's much different. We're moving towards multipolarity. We've seen not only the rise of China, obviously, but also the rise of Russia. We see India as a rising power. We see countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Indonesia and plenty of others that are rising as well. So we're moving towards a world order that's very similar to the 19th century, where if you look at the world order of the 19th century, you didn't really have either a unipolar hegemon or a bipolar world like in the Cold War. Instead, you had different empires that had their different spheres of influence. There was about a dozen or so European empires. I mean, the British Empire was obviously the largest one, but then you had the French and the Germans and Italians and Dutch and Belgians.
Yeah, and the Spanish was pretty big.
Yeah, the remnants of the Spanish Empire. They had been in decline by that point, but Spain and Portugal and all of that. And then you had the Russian Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire, and then Japan was a rising power in East Asia, of course, and then the United States in North America, the continental American state, and becoming a hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. So you had about a dozen or so major powers around 1900, of which the British were the largest, and others competed for their own spheres of influence through their colonial systems and all of that. But then economically, they were integrated through liberalism and trade and through the City of London and the financial institutions of the time, the Rothschilds and all that kind of stuff. And I think we're now moving into a system that's somewhat similar to that, in the sense that we're moving into a system where a world system where there's not any one hegemonic power. Instead, you have multiple powers that have their own spheres of influence. And while we don't really have old style colonialism like we did in the 19th century, we do have spheres of influence through client states and that kind of stuff. And obviously, it's the United States, the European Union, Russia, China, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia. All of these different India. These different major powers, major world powers, are emerging, but in a way that's still economically integrated. Whenever people ask me about who the global power elite are, to me, it's not so much the Illuminati and the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians. I'm not.
Like that guy's been saying that Chinese guy's been saying that, and I'm like, well, that's your
Professor Zhang. Yeah, he's a really interesting character. We can talk about.
He is. It's great theories, but then his conclusion is just so nonsensical to me. I'm just like, oh God, like what?
But no, I mean, the real global ruling class isn't anything quite that exotic. It's I think the global ruling class is basically global asset management firms, of which BlackRock is probably the most influential. Private equity, that's stuff like Blackstone. Obviously, the central banks of different countries, and the Federal Reserve and Bank of Europe and all that kind of stuff, Bank of International Settlements. The growing crossover that you see between tech and finance, and these big tech oligopolies like guys like Bezos and Musk and Peter Thiel and these characters, the sovereign wealth funds of different countries, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, all of that, the state capital like you find in Russia and China and some countries, all of these kinds of things together, I think, are the foundation of an emerging global financial system that is increasingly integrated, even if there's no unipolar central power. It's almost.
And are you saying that BRICS and Russia and China are integrated with that, like despite their supposed opposition, or no?
Yeah. Well, that gets to the point that I was making, I think, in the video that you're referencing, and that it seems to me that increasingly, as the BRICS are a rising power collectively, or represent a collection of rising powers, it seems to me that global finance capital, including in the West, is increasingly pivoting eastward. And I think a big part of that explains the Trump administration and some of its actions. Like if you look at what the Trump administration has actually done in his second term, I think his first term was a little different, but in his second term, one of the things he did was tariff mania. There's
terrorism.
Yeah. Well, that was being sold to his fans as economic nationalism. We're protecting American industries and jobs and that kind of stuff. And there might be some peripheral benefit there. There may be cost to that as well. But I think that the real function of that is to actually weaken the United States economically. And I think a lot of Trump's attacks on allies like European countries and other countries in the Western Hemisphere, Canada and Mexico and all of that, all of his efforts to alienate allies are rooted in an effort that's, whatever his personal motivations, I think behind him are people who see this as a tool through which the United States can be weakened and isolated internationally. And the purpose of that is to fire the U.S. as the global hegemon. I think that there's a lot of elements associated with global finance capital that want to transition to multipolarity, some of whom want to pivot towards the East, towards the BRICS and all of that. And that's easier done when there isn't the United States as a unipolar hegemon. In fact, one of the reasons why the liberal Atlanticist, the liberal wing of the American ruling class, and then the Atlanticist interest that it's connected to in Europe, Chatham House and that kind of stuff, and certainly the neocons, the people who write for the Atlantic magazine. The reason they're so opposed to Trump, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons that they're so opposed to Trump is that they see him having this effect. They see that he's weakening this system of American unipolar hegemony. Now, sometimes I hear Trump referred to by some of his critics as a neocon. And
Mhm.
I understand why people say that. They say, well, he's very pro-Zionist, he's went to war with Iran and all of that. But I think that's a misuse of the term neocon. Neocons are something more specific. The neocon movement came out of the left, and it was also associated with hardline Zionism as well. But neocons of the type that were dominant back during the George W. Bush era, Bush Jr., the war on terrorism and all that, the neocons are very American centric. Now, they're also hardline Zionists, but they envision a Pax Americana. They envision a world where America is like the Roman Empire or like the British Empire, a dominant world power. They have these phrases like benevolent global hegemony and national greatness and all of that. But they want the United States to rule the world. And they're aggressively pro-globalist and globalization and neoliberalism and democratism and all of that kind of stuff. And then as far as the Zionist component, they want the U.S. and Israel to have this special relationship. And Israel is kind of like a junior partner, a co-equal with the United States in this world order. It's like America rules the world for the good of all and with a special care for Israel. That's the neocon vision. That's what Bill Kristol and David Fromm and Paul Wolfowitz and Norman Podhoretz and all of these kinds of people. That was their vision. That's the neocon vision. And in the Bush Jr. administration, I think they were trying to implement that. I think that's a big part of what the original war in Iraq, well, not the first one, but the second one, that's a big part of what that was about. Some of the subsequent wars with Libya and Syria and so forth, I think a lot that vision is a big part of what that was about. But I think we're in a different situation now. Like, if we go back to the first Gulf War in 1991, we see that George W. Bush pretty much, George H.W. Bush, so George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, he pretty much ordered the Israelis not to retaliate when Iraq, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, was firing Scud missiles at them. Right now, you wouldn't see a modern American president do that. I think in many ways, George H.W. Bush was the last WASP president in the sense that he was the last American president that represented.
He probably will be the last WASP. He will be the last WASP, that's for sure.
Well, he was the last president that I think represented our traditional WASP elite, which is the traditional American ruling class. This kind of, when I was a kid, I grew up around a lot of conservative circle, Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, John Birch Society type people, and they always had this animus towards the Eastern establishment. But what they meant was just the traditional ruling class,
right?
At the WASP patricians of the Northeast, as opposed to the Sun Belt, the South, and the Midwest, and all that.
Okay.
But I think George H.W. Bush was really the last president of the traditional WASP elite. And then at the end of the Cold War, during that same period, you see a generational changeover in American leadership, where you see the baby boomer generation comes to power. And parallel to that, I think you start to see a demographic changeover where the demography of the American ruling class starts to change a bit. Like as far as the U.S. relationship with Israel, the traditional left-wing critique of that, like Noam Chomsky, if you want to talk about him more, fine. But he pretty much established the left party line on the U.S.-Israel relationship, and that is that Israel is just a client state of the United States, and yes, they mistreat the Palestinians and Lebanese and all of that, but it's just like all these other American client states during the Cold War or afterward that don't respect human rights. It's just like Pinochet's Chile and Suharto's Indonesia, and
most of those are not. Most of those are hard to compare, though, in terms of the brutality. Right.
But that's the left wing line. Even today, that's a big part. A big part of the American left. That's what they believe.
So they blame it all on what it's. They boil it down to sort of European colonialism. Let me just say though, in what you're saying. So is that what you think? You think that Israel is a client state of America, where I would think it's more the reverse, and America is a client state of Israel.
Well, I'm not really in either of those camps. I think it's a lot more complicated, either one of those. But
Well, like, what do you think
I
about
think,
the Epstein files, and then what they revealed as, like, in terms of who's being blackmailed, and if you look at,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know, the
Well,
behavior of these people, including.
this is
Sorry,
the
go on.
general sketch of how I think that works. All right.
Okay.
During the Cold War period, like during the 1950s, the 60s, into the 70s, maybe in the 80s, I think the Chomsky model of Israel as a U.S. client state, or as a client state of Western or U.S. imperialism, was closer to the truth than it is now. I think even then there were certain anomalies that can't really be explained entirely with that model. Like, why was the United States so tolerant of the attack on the USS Liberty, for example? But and there's other things too. But I think that model was closer to the truth during the Cold War. Now, in fact, I used to hold to that view. Like back in the 90s, if you had asked me, I probably would have had a view like that. After 9/11, after all the post 9/11 wars, it became pretty obvious that it was more than just Israel being a client state, that Israel was a primary driving force in American foreign policy. And that's the kind of argument you would still get today from somebody like John Mearsheimer. Like Mearsheimer, he wrote the famous book about 20 years ago, The Israel Lobby. And he's arguing that, the reason for all of this all these American wars in the Middle East is the Israel lobby just has so much power over the American government and foreign policy apparatus. And I think that point of view was probably closer to the truth when that book was written 20 years ago, describing the events of 20, 25, 30 years ago. But I think that increasingly over time, and this involves the wider demographic and generational and cultural changes we've seen in the United States. Over time, I think that as the power of the traditional WASP elite has declined, the power of the Jewish Zionist elite has increased, to where if you look at the ruling class pyramid today, the Jewish Zionist elite is at the very tippy top of the ruling class pyramid. And I think that for that reason, the Zionism is at the vanguard. I mean, the United States is still imperialist in a wider sense. That's true. But Zionism is really the vanguard of American and Western imperialism today. It's like, what the Spanish were at one point, what the British were at one point, what the Americans were at one point. The Zionists are that today. They're not just part of imperialism. They're the vanguard of imperialism. Yeah. And what was, we had, in the ancient world, we had Pax Romana, we had Pax Britannia, we had Pax Americana. Now we've got Pax Judaica. And I think that that's really the direction that the world has gone in more, certainly in the last couple of decades.
So how does that? So when you describe that, tying in it, what you're saying about the world financial direction towards a moving eastward, are you saying that's money and power heading for Israel, or is it, you mean like Israel making inroads into India now, or is this what you mean?
All of that and more. All right, I mentioned that the neocons that were dominant during the George W. Bush era, they're very American centric. They envisioned American unipolar hegemony. All right. Well, the current crop of Zionists don't have that outlook per se. They may view American power as a useful tool, but other than that, they could care less about America. I mean, in their view, America is useful to the degree America serves Zionist interests. And if it's not serving Zionist interests, well, too bad for America. The Israeli strategy, the strategy of the Israeli state itself. Now, Zionism is more than just the Israeli state. That's another important point. But the Israeli state has always worked the East-West angle at various points, depending on what was strategically advantageous at the time. For instance, in the current war in Ukraine, with the Russia versus Ukraine, with the Western backing Ukraine, Russia is not part of the Western alliance against Russia. I mean, Israel is not part of the Western alliance against Russia. Israel has never joined in on the sanctions against Russia. In Russia, in Israel itself, in Israel proper, about 20% of the Jewish population of Israel are Russian-speaking Israelis, who many of whom are
Yeah, I heard that.
pro-Putin,
Yeah,
pro-Russian, and all of that.
yeah.
So Russia.
I heard that. I heard that plays a part into Putin's willingness level of support for the Iran. I know they're sort of on the same side, but that they have not done more. It's speculated.
Well, the Russians and the Chinese both have a foreign policy towards the Middle East or West Asia, where they like to maintain a balance of power between the contending forces. Between the Israelis and Arabs and Shia and Sunni and all of these different factional and sectarian disputes and all of that. They're not like the Americans, where the Americans are clearly siding, obviously, with the Zionists and with the Wahhabis and the wider Sunni bloc. The Russians and Chinese, particularly the Chinese, but the Russians too, tend to take a more nuanced approach, in the sense that they like
what's in it for us, I guess. Or is it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they'll support Israel when it's in their interest. They'll support Saudi Arabia when it's in their interest, but they'll support Iran, and so forth. But but the crop of Zionists that we see today, including in the United States, in my opinion, that is the people who've risen into top positions in the Trump administration, and I would argue in the Biden administration. I think that their model of Zionism is more Israel-centric. It's not American-centric, in the sense that they really do favor a type of Zionism that is a global Zionism. It's Pax Judaica. It's Israel is like the mother country, perhaps, but they envision a type of global Zionist empire that includes the diaspora, that includes the Zionist tentacles that are now expanding into the East and into the global South, the India and Africa and Argentina. Yeah. And so I think that and also it's a more extreme form of Zionism. Like under President Biden, you had people like Anthony Blinken that are kind of in the old neocon model, the kind of American-centric liberal internationalist model. But still very neoconish, Likud aligned and that kind of stuff. But I think a lot of the people in Trump's administration are simply Israel firsters. They're just simply, either for religious reasons or ethnic reasons or some other reason, they just are Israel first. I think Jared Kushner is an Israel firster. I think Steve Witkoff.
Well, anyone who's Jewish and a dual citizen there is obviously. I don't think. Is there a single one that isn't?
Yeah.
Really.
And that's true of some of the Gentile Zionists as well, like Mike Hucksterby. Mike Hucksterby, as I call him, but Mike Hucksterby. Yeah,
what would your? He's like the old school televangelist type guy. What would your old man think of him? Does he like him, or does he?
Well, my parents are not Christian Zionists. I went to a Christian Zionist school, but the church denomination I was a part of wasn't that. No, they don't. My parents actually don't particularly like the Christian Zionists. They're very Republican. They've always been very Republican, but they're not that big on the Christian Zionists.
I forget, because I know there's so many. I always think of the evangelicals as one big thing, but you're right. You pointed out earlier, there's so many different groups. But Huckabee seems to me like just not a smart guy at all. Like just kind of a.
Well, no, he's dumb as a rock, but he's also a hardcore Christian Zionist. And I think he's just basically an Israel firster. I think he looks
for religious reasons. Unlike the others, he's in it for religious reasons.
I think he looks at it like he's chosen by God to use his position to defend Israel. So his relationship with America is he just happens to be American because God put him in that position to defend Israel. I think that's. No, he's just as fanatically Zionist as Meir Kahane or somebody like that.
Seems to be.
And I think that's the model of Zionism that's now dominant in the current administration. I think in the current administration, the Zionists that are dominant in the administration are Kahanists. Not liberal Zionists, not neocons. Not even Likudniks. But more like Kahanists, like the far right end of ultra Zionism. If you look at the people who are backing Trump financially, like the Adelsons, for example, that's what they are. They're just Israeli nationalists. They could care less about America. To them, America's a place to make money through running casinos. Other than that, Israel is their real country.
Where do the Likudniks fall into that? You're saying that they're not? Are they? They're on the near the far right side of it? Is it? in terms of,
Well,
or
as,
what are
as
they?
Norman Finkelstein says, the government of Israel today basically includes the right, the far right, and the ultra right. The Likudniks are the party that's derivative of revisionist Zionism or Jabotinsky, and originally they came to power in Israel in the 70s under Menachem Begin, Begin, who had been a terrorist for the Stern Gang back in the 40s. But so that's the Likudniks. Now the Likudniks have always had this vision of a greater Israel, and by greater Israel they mean all of the land in West Asia that is considered to be the biblical promised land. Like the biblical promised land, according to them, is between the Nile in Egypt through the Euphrates, which is in Iraq. All right. So,
Yeah.
in fact, there are actually maps that the hardline Zionists will circulate. Bezalel Smotrich, for example, who's the finance minister of Israel, he gave a lecture in France a couple of years ago to a Zionist group in France, and he's holding up a map of Greater Israel as he envisions it, and it's exactly the territory I'm talking about now. There are factions within the IDF that wear patches on their uniforms of this image of a Greater Israel. That's not part of their official
Yeah,
uniform.
I've seen that. Yeah, but I even saw I saw that you know that guy brother Nathaniel. Have you ever seen him?
Yeah,
Brother.
yeah,
I saw him post a map that included Ukraine in Greater Israel. I don't know how
yeah.
exaggerated.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because on the Ukraine war, there seems to be a split within Zionism. You have, for example, the American-style neocons who are very hawkish on Ukraine and very anti-Russian.
Yeah.
The American neocons are very anti-Russian. They're obviously anti-Arab and anti-Muslim. They're also anti-German for obvious reasons, but they're extremely hawkish on Ukraine. And I think that the reason for that is they still want revenge for the Cossacks. They still want revenge for the Pale of Settlement. And I think some of them probably view Ukraine as Israel 2.0. You know, if anything, it can be a substitute for Israel if Israel goes down. But
they like to. They probably like to control that the black soil, the famous agricultural area as well. That's the bread basket of the. In fact, they pretty much do know. I think through the BlackRock, probably as far as I know. I think it's.
Well,
I think that's all.
It's interesting you mentioned that because, all right, like if you look at what the Trump administration has done with Ukraine, we see that Witkoff and Kushner have gotten involved in the negotiations over Ukraine, and BlackRock has also gotten involved in the negotiations over Ukraine.
Larry Fink, and don't you find that cynical though that they're all Jews that Trump would send Wilkoff and his son-in-law Kushner, the slumlord Kushner, and neither of them are diplomats, or they're just these guys he knew. I find that incredibly cynical.
I posted a joke on Facebook recently. I posted a meme about that Jose Nino came up with, a meme about Witkoff and Kushner. And I joked that in future political science textbooks, in political science textbooks, you've got all the theories of international relations, like they talk about realism and liberal internationalism, constructivism, all these different paradigms in international relations. But I was saying that in the future, because of these guys, we're going to have the slumlord theory of international relations as well. But the feeling though that I get about Larry Fink is Jewish and he's a Zionist. He was involved in trying to suppress the pro-Palestinian protests when those broke out. But I don't see him as either a Kahanist or Likudnik or even an American-style neocon. I think that Larry Fink is probably closer to being like a Rothschild type of Zionism, where
what's that?
There's a type of Zionism that is largely
Jesus, all the time. You've got them all. You must have an encyclopedia of this shit. How do you? Anyways, go on. Yeah, tell me. Rothschild. Well, I mean, I know they're apart and above everything else, but what is their Zionism exactly? How is it different?
Well, for them, Zionism was like a philanthropist project, But I think that the types of Zionism that are affiliated with that kind of tradition, the Rothschild tradition, I think envision a global Zionist empire in a de facto sense, a kind of Pax Judaica, as some thinkers are calling it now. Like Professor Jang is one, David Miller, Dr. David Miller is another. But they envision a sort of global diaspora Zionist empire where Israel as a state is kind of like a nexus that, it's like a trade hub that connects the East and West, like the city of London, not London.
Okay, so they don't feel the need for a greater Israel? Is that what you mean, or no?
They don't seem to be as aggressive about it. In fact, I think this is a major point of contention within international Zionism. It seems like these Rothschild types are mostly interested in the diaspora.
And having the gangster's paradise. They have the gangster's paradise where they all run to.
Yeah. That all of that is about embedment in institutions across nations and that kind of stuff.
Well, I can't see them ever giving that up, but they have that already. I mean, they even say, Putin has a certain connection to the what do you call it? The what's that sect called? You mentioned it. We were talking about Likud. It doesn't. He has some connection with them as well of some kind. I don't know how.
Yeah. Well,
he doesn't. He's definitely not as controlled by them. He's not as controlled as Trump somehow, or as influenced, let's say. But he has.
I've pointed that out before to people. I know people who were like white nationalists and national socialists and who like Putin for whatever reason, this or that reason, and they view him as some sort of nationalist who's giving the middle finger to the Zionist empire, the globalist empire. But the thing is, Russia has the same kind of Jewish oligarch class as the Western countries, and so does Ukraine, for that matter. It's like, now it's true that in Russia, the oligarch class is more controlled. I guess it's more subordinate.
Yeah, he killed a lot of them. He did.
Yeah. Or exiled them,
Or exiled them, yeah.
That's another factor that goes into anti-Putinism that you find in the West.
But he's still pally with them, and he's still kind of. Yeah, I wonder. I mean, who knows? But yeah, it seems like.
And you have that in Ukraine as well. You have that in Ukraine. They have their Jewish oligarch class. In fact, some people interpret that war as an intra-Zionist conflict. Which I don't think that's the whole.
If you look at that level of embedded power, like how is there any hope of why do we even bother talking about it? Like, it's just like we should just accept. Well,
it's kind of well, I guess it just depends on if you're interested in figuring out how the world works or not. But
well, exactly, you do want to know, and it's how embedded are they, and how it seems like everyone's saying they're on. Okay, so part of the point of all this is that everyone says they're on the ropes now with this Iran business and all this. Like, how do you feel about how they're doing and what the plan is? Iran and the way it's going.
Yeah. Well, as I was saying, to finish my previous point.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Go on now.
You have the aggressive Israeli nationalists who are all about the greater Israel. They want greater Israel. They want it now. There's what's called the Oded Yenon plan, which is about a plan that was developed back in the early 80s for basically, eradicating the surrounding countries and creating a Zionist empire in West Asia, a greater Israel. And then, like I said, you've got others that are more oriented towards the diaspora, that are more about building a global diaspora empire through transnational institutions. I think BlackRock is definitely in that camp. I think Steve Witkoff is probably in that camp. Jared Kushner, his family has connections to Netanyahu and Chabad and the Lubavitchers and Likud. So Jared may be.
Kushner is the most blatantly evil-looking person I've seen probably ever.
Yeah.
What do you think? Like, Jesus.
Oh, there's an interesting interview on some YouTube channel I was watching recently about with Chris Christie, who is the former presidential candidate, he was a federal prosecutor who actually prosecuted Jared Kushner's father for election fraud.
Yeah.
And what Chris Christie says about the Kushner family is interesting. So I think that right now what we're seeing is, as we're seeing this transition to multipolarity away from unipolarity, there are splits within Zionism about how to handle that.
Okay.
I think the neocon Zionists and some of the liberal Zionists and the more Western-centric Zionists want to maintain unipolarity. They want to maintain,
and that's the secular Zionists, like
Mostly, yeah,
Yeah.
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 That would be like the American style neocons. That's like all the Jewish neocons and Zionists that write for the Atlantic magazine and appear on the Bulwark YouTube channel, and the Bill Cristols and David Fromes and
Mhm.
Tony Blinkens and Bob Kagans and Vicky Mulans.
Yeah.
And they're very hawkish against Russia on Ukraine. You
Yeah.
know, but that's the more neocon camp. They want to
Okay.
maintain unipolar hegemony. Then you've got the ultra Zionist, the hardline Israeli nationalists, the rightier end of Likud, and all that kind of stuff. And this includes some of the Christian Zionists as well. They just want greater Israel. I think they're more about greater Israel. And then they're in favor of working the east-west angle. I mean, they'll align with India, they'll align with Russia if necessary. They'll align with Saudi Arabia. And to them, America and Europe are useful only to the degree they serve Zionism. And then you've also got the overt globalist. I think that Larry Fink is in that camp.
And that's the Rothschild.
That's the Rothschild model. It's about the empire, the diaspora empire across national and institutional boundaries.
So they would be of those three. They would the latter. Then the last one would be the head of the totem. Would you say, or no?
Well, I think that's the one that's most deeply embedded in global finance capital.
Yeah.
And it's not the sum total of global finance capital, but it's more integrated with these other sectors of global finance capital, like banks in Europe that are Russian connected, like state capital in Russia and China and places like that, like the Gulf states, the sovereign wealth funds in Singapore and all of that. So they're more interested in facilitating the transition to multipolarity, which means American power has to retreat. And I think that's a big division in the world, in the American ruling class and in the international ruling class. The international ruling class is more than just Zionists or the Jews and all of that. I don't want to take an overly reductionist or determinist view of this, but within global capitalism, the global power elite worldwide, you find this very powerful Jewish presence and Zionist presence that's embedded in institutions and countries all over the place. And that's the diaspora. That's the diaspora empire. Pax Judaica. And then you've got the Israeli nationalist, Israel itself, and then the Israeli nationalists with their plans for greater Israel. And then you've got the U.S. and English neocons with their idea of a sort of an Atlanticist Zionism.
Right. Okay. And are they warring with each other, these three groups? Because I haven't.
Well, I mean, it's no different than political disputes within countries. It's like liberals and conservatives and moderates, and all what to prioritize and what's most important. But yeah, I think in the United States, and I think in Western countries generally, we currently see sharp divisions within the ruling classes on a more general level. Like there's this book. I'd highly recommend this book. This is by Caleb Maupin.
It's so small. It's like a pamphlet.
Yeah, it is, but it's a good book. It's called Divisions in the Ruling Class. And Caleb's analysis is rooted heavily in older thinkers like Carl Oglesby and some of those who saw conflict within the United States as being primarily between the traditional Eastern establishment, the Yankees, the Northeasterners, the WASP elite, and the Sun Belt, cowboy capitalism, and that's Texas oil and Midwestern agribusiness, and
that's your side.
That's
your side. That's your background. No,
well, geographically, yeah. So the Yankee Cowboy War is what Carl Oglesby labeled this back in the 70s. And I think that's largely correct as far as the American ruling class generally. Now, I would add to that in recent decades, recent generations, we've seen that expand a bit, where you've seen the rise of Silicon Valley. We've seen the rise of what I call neo-finance capital. And that's things like financialization and hedge funders and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of that stuff was originally aligned with the liberal wing of the ruling class, and some of it still is. But if you look at what's happened in recent years, you see that a range of interests that were initially aligned with the Atlanticist, liberal transatlantic wing of the ruling class have sort of switched sides. Like BlackRock did that. Some of the tech oligarchs, the Elon Musk types, the Jeff Bezos types, a lot of that started moving over into Trump's camp around the time that he became president a second time. And we've seen that in Europe as well. And if you look at European politics, they have a similar division to what you find in the United States. It's not quite as extreme, but you see a divide between what Thomas Piketty, the French economist, calls the Brahmin left, which is kind of like the finance-connected, cosmopolitan, progressive managerial elites. And then the merchant right, which is more the petty bourgeoisie or the national industrial bourgeoisie. And the latter is in part aligned with the right in Europe, and the former is aligned with the left. But you see that Zionists have their hands in all of it. You see, for example, that the supposed Euro-nationalist parties are mostly Zionist. For example, in France, you've got the national, I think they're called the National Rally now, the Le Pens. There was a conference on anti-Semitism in Israel, in Jerusalem, a couple of years ago, and you had representatives from all these Euro-nationalist parties there, expressing solidarity with the Israeli state, including groups like the National Rally and that kind of stuff. So you see that the merchant right, the national industrial bourgeoisie, and then their constituents on the ground tend to be the more traditional working class.
Even though the original Le Pen was not such a person, that's for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
The guy is named after. And then you have Spain. You have the leftist Spain is the only one that's really now overtly anti-Zionist.
Yeah, well, in France, it's Mélenchon is probably the most anti-Zionist of any of the major figures, political figures. I mean, compared to the Macron faction as well as the Le Pen faction. Yeah. But the Zionists have their hands in all of that. I mean, they have their hands in the Brahmin left, the merchant right, the Euro-nationalists, all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, they do.
Because Europe is basically, for a long time, it was basically just sort of like a junior partner of America, and still is to a large degree, so Zionist power, I don't think is quite as deeply entrenched in all of Europe as it is in America, but it's a close second.
But certainly the finance capital business is, and like the whole basis for the continual open borders immigration that everybody's trying to do something about. It feels like nothing will be done about it for as long as we have a system of where finance capital is the ruling ideology. It's based on somehow migrant labor and just generally the whole system of having open borders and slowly killing yourself racially. And I don't know.
Well, I also think it's true that if you look at culturally, if you look at Europe, Zionist influence tends to be more pervasive in Northern Europe than in Southern and Eastern Europe. I mean, there's nuance to that. But,
well, Ireland is probably where I am. Is probably the most apart. Like they're not as hardline as Spain is currently, but generally speaking, they've been again for the reason partially the reason because of the revolution here, and the Protestants always were the Zionists and Catholics were traditionally the opposite. So for that reason, basically.
I was just going to say that worldwide, the most Protestant countries tend to be the most Zionist countries as well.
They do, even though Martin Luther had that extreme. I don't know if you've read his. Did you read
against certain folks and their lies? Yeah.
Holy shit! That's the most anti-Semitic thing I ever heard in my life.
Right.
Never said anything crazy.
Yeah. Well, the thing about Germany, though, is because we were talking about this on a program I was on earlier today, because one of the co-panelists was German. But, my understanding of the woke phenomena, the politically correct, woke, social justice warrior, whatever you want to call it, phenomena, is that the cultural backstory to that, the intellectual history of that, is to a large degree rooted in Protestantism. That kind of stuff is largely a modern incarnation of at least the psychology of Protestant pietism. Because if you look around the world, woke, PC, all that has its deepest roots in historically Protestant countries, just like Zionism has its deepest roots in historically Protestant countries. And in America, for example, just say on the race issue in America, in some ways, the American progressive culture takes the historic spiritual redemption narrative that you find in Christianity. Jesus died for our sins, and they secularize that and replace it with a racial redemption narrative where figures like, say, Martin Luther King become like a modern Jesus Christ, a martyr who died for the sin of racism, and the Germans have something similar with the Holocaust. It's like, and I saw a joke about this one time. It was a play on the Bible quote from John 3:16. It's, for God so loved the world that he gave the 6 million. So they have their own similar redemption narrative where they culturally they define themselves as atoning for the sin of the Holocaust.
Oh, and they make a heroism of it.
Yeah,
that explains a lot of Mertz's actions, actually, if you think about it.
But Ireland,
that's very not. I didn't understand that. Yeah,
Ireland is one of the, I would say, one of the least Zionist countries in Europe, certainly in Western Europe, is Ireland.
It's not popular. It's not popular to be. It never was, though. Even like it's definitely not popular now with the war and everything. But at no point.
Well, the Irish know what it. The Irish know what it is to be a people under colonization and subjugation. So there's more natural sympathy for the Palestinians there, and also Ireland is a Catholic country. Northern Ireland, the Protestant sectors aren't, but then that feeds into what you were saying earlier.
If you go up there, you'll see a Star of David murals and stuff like that when you cross the border into the north.
Yeah, exactly. And was Ian Paisley a Christian Zionist? He probably was.
Probably.
It just sounds like something.
I don't know. It could be. Whatever. I don't even know what branch of Protestant. I mean, Church of England, Church of Ireland. I don't. What's the difference? I don't know because there's.
I think he was a Calvinist. I think he was in the Reformed.
Okay.
Tradition. Yeah.
Oh right. Okay. Yeah. Right. I don't even know. Oh, so Orangemen are Calvinists.
Yeah.
I've never even known.
I think they've got their own tradition. It's like.
Yeah.
I think Ian Paisley was actually banned from the United States at one point. He was considered a terrorist. So it's interesting how you have the way it breaks down along these kinds of geographical and religious and cultural lines. The most Protestant countries are also the most woke and also the most Zionists. And then we see that now on a worldwide level. Like I was talking about this idea of Pax Judaica and a global diaspora empire and a global Zionist empire. We're starting to see Zionism, including Christian Zionism, take root now more in the global South and in Africa and in Asia, in places like South Korea. Huh?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I know. I've noticed this a little bit. Yeah.
And that's an American export. And a lot of it has to do with the exportation of American Protestant culture through missionaries.
Yeah. And you see it here with let me just say this, because you see it here with like Africans that come here, like people from Africa move to Ireland, but they'll create a church. It's very much a Billy Graham style.
Mm-hmm.
It's very American.
Exactly. Yeah. Kenyans, Ugandans, a lot of the Central Africans, South Koreans, you find a lot of this. Filipinos, you find a fair amount of this among Protestants. Brazilians, among Protestants in Latin America. Bukele, the president of El Salvador, is aligned with Christian Zionists, which is interesting because he's part Palestinian in his ancestry. He's basically a Latino Arab Palestinian.
He was a Christian Zionist.
He's aligned with. I don't know what he personally believes.
Okay, all right.
Okay. He's aligned with he's always trying to brown nose the United States, which means brown nosing Zionism, which means getting in good with the Christian Zionists and all that kind of stuff. So so he's connected to that. And then of course you got Javier Milei. I mean, he's like a parody. You know, it's like
Yeah, that guy. That's just,
yeah. Yeah. So yeah, you're starting to see Zionists, you know, gain a foothold largely through, I think, Christian Zionism and Protestant Christian Zionism throughout the global South, and also we see this interesting alliance forming between Zionism and the Hinduvata between the Hindu nationalists. In the modism and all of that. In fact, I know a while back, Roseanne Barr, you know, the comedian, she's Jewish, a Zionist, and she was lambasting American anti-Zionist or something, and she said, "Well, if the Americans were to turn against us, we just align ourselves with India," you know. So that's sort of like and I think that's where the Israeli nationalists are today. I think they could look at it like, well, you know, anti-Zionist sentiment is rising in Europe and America, so hey, if that's a problem, we'll just look east. We'll just align ourselves with the Hindus, because see, for the Hindu nationalists, they view the Muslims as their main enemy. So they view the Zionists as fellow travelers against the Muslims.
I do wonder, are they making a mistake? Because now the Zionists have their eyes on them right now, and they're just like they do in Japan. You see what they're doing in Japan right now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're right. They have their eyes on doing something similar. I don't know what you could do to India. I guess they could always import like a billion Africans and make it even worse. But
well, I think institutional colonization is more the issue. It's Tulsi Gabbard, you know, who is the.
So you're saying she's a Hindu? I never knew. I thought she was some kind of Christian, but you're saying she's a Bhagavad Gita. What do you call him? Hare Krishna? Is she?
She is from a cult called the Science of Identity, and it's led by Christopher Butler, but it's a spinoff of the American Hare Krishnas from the 70s.
Oh, right, yeah, okay.
But ideologically,
that's weird. That's weird, and for her to be in office like that with a weirdo Hare Krishna thing.
Oh wait, it's like having a Scientologist as director of national intelligence. Yeah, but the Science of Identity cult are Hindu nationalist and pro-India. So, you know, she basically is for India what the Zionists are for Israel. You know, it's like she's an Hindu first or Hindu nationalist.
Well, she's half Indian, I think, isn't she? She's half Indian and half.
She's Samoan. She's half Samoan and half white, but
she's a handsome woman for such a combination. You'd think.
She grew up with this. I mean, her family was part of the Science of Identity cult.
Oh, shit. Okay, right.
Yeah, but
and she's normally pretty good. I understand she's maybe going to resign. I heard there's talk of her resigning or objecting somehow. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think she's being attacked. From what I can tell, the things that really drive her politics are anti-Islam and India first, and working herself into a position of power to advance.
Oh, so that's it. But she was very kind of anti-Zionist before.
She's against the regime change wars that the neocons were behind. The reason for that is she recognizes that actually has the effect of fueling Takfiri Islamist terrorism, like what happened when Iraq and fell. You know, I mean, we got ISIS. You know, I mean, now that Syria has fallen, what happened? Well, Al Qaeda's taken over Syria. So a Hindu nationalist wouldn't view the proliferation of Islamist terrorist groups as strategically advantageous. Now, if you're a neocon who's mostly concerned about Israel, then you like that kind of thing because you see these states that are rivals of Israel being eliminated. Of course, the neocons had this fantasy about converting the Middle East into, you know, liberal democracies like Europe and that kind of stuff too. You know, like they thought they were going to redo the occupation of Japan and
the Arab Spring.
Yeah. So, you know, so that's the kind of worldview the neocons have. You know.
But so you were reaching a culminating point, I think. Were you not?
Yeah, well, I was just saying that the strategic views of these different factions vary, even if they have similar or overlapping goals. But like in the case of the global Zionists, like you were asking me about the program I did on the U.S. getting fired as CEO of the New World Order. Yeah.
The whole point of it, right? That was it.
Okay, yeah. I think that sectors within global finance capital, Zionist and otherwise,
Yeah.
want to pivot eastward because that's just where the opportunity is. I mean, somebody like Elon Musk, he does not want to put sanctions on Russia and China. No, he wants to do business in places like that. Mark
Right.
Zuckerberg, he wants
Yeah.
Facebook to operate in places like that. Jeff
Right.
Bezos, he wants there to be branches of Amazon in Russia and China.
Zuckerberg, who now has a position in the government somehow. What is it? Something or other.
Oh, he was one of the people bankrolling Trump's ballroom addition to the White House or something. I know that's
The
one
Gypsy
thing.
edition.
Yeah,
I saw it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And the same is true with the global finance capitalists like Larry Fink and or like private equity firms like Blackstone. All of those want to do business in Russia, in China, in the BRICS countries. It's not in their interest to put sanctions on countries like that or go to war with countries like that. In
Right.
fact, I know American communists who have a generally favorable view of Trump on some levels because they think he's creating, and I think correctly, I think they're correct in this assessment, creating a set of policies that is going to lead to greater East-West financial integration, with the BRICS. Now, the problem with that is that you've also got the Zionist element that's trying to create havoc in the Middle East. And also, I think that the Western sectors of global finance capital, I don't think they view Russia and China as partners. I think they just view them as more entities to colonize and cannibalize, just like they've done in the West. So
Yeah.
I don't see this as like just fostering international trade and cooperation and détente. But
So
that
you
seems
think they're shooting Trump like a gun, let's say, and they don't care what the consequences or what happened. Obviously, his approval rating is fucking gone, and all this kind of shit.
Oh yeah. Well, all right. That gets back to a point I was making earlier. Like, as I said, a lot of these elites within new capital, the BlackRock types, the tech oligarchs, notice how most of those were initially on the liberal side of the political spectrum in the United States.
Right.
BlackRock, as recently as 2020, BlackRock was promoting ESG, and a lot of these companies were putting Black Lives Matter and rainbow flag banners on their corporate websites.
Yeah.
But then a lot of them lurched rightward when Trump came into office the second time. And I think that was a calculation. I think there's several things that were at place there. I think the BlackRock types saw Trump as a tool. They saw his tariff mania as a tool for actually weakening the United States and then isolating the United States in the process and thereby speeding up the transition towards multipolarity.
Yeah.
And I think the tech oligarchs see the same thing. They have this ideology, this neo-reactionary ideology. I think they see Trumpism as a vehicle for advancing that on some level. But I think they also have a somewhat similar vision as far as multipolarity and global economic integration with the BRICS and all of that kind of stuff. And then you also have the ultra Zionists. A lot of those started lurching rightward after October 7th, the Bill Ackmans and Larry Ellisons and those kinds of people. And they started trying to weaponize conservative anti-woke against the pro-Palestinian movement. And a lot of them threw in their weight with Trump, and then not the neocons, but just the Israel firsters and the coup connected people, in this country, like the Lindsey Grahams and all of that kind of stuff. So that's where I think all that stands. But here's what I'm thinking. I may be wrong, but here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that while Trump is being used as a tool for facilitating the transition to multipolarity and also for expanding the Zionist interest in a greater Israel and eliminating Iran and all of that.
Yeah.
I don't think that the elites of global finance capital, now the ultra Zionists are a different question, but the elites of global finance capital, I don't think want to have complete chaos in the United States. Like, I don't think they want America to become just a basket case country that falls apart. So I think they're also somewhat concerned about destabilization.
Hmm.
My guess is that as the midterm elections come up this year, and as the 2028 presidential election comes out, they will seek to reinstall the Democrats as the ruling party for the purposes of stabilization.
Well,
Like
it
I
shouldn't be
think
hard. His approval is so shit. Like, for
well,
election.
yeah. We'll if this is true, if it goes down this way, we'll
Yeah.
start to see signals as we get closer. As far as where the money's being sent, as far as signals coming from the media. Like I noticed that when Trump was running for re-election, around the time
the money moved to him. The money moved to the right for sure. Yeah.
money started moving to him.
Yeah.
After he was shot in Butler, you started seeing themes emerging in the media. Well, hey, this guy's not so bad. Give him a chance. So, and I think we'll start to see signals like that from the other direction as these elections come up. Because I think what's being done is that global finance capital, the global power elite, is using Trumpism first to weaken and isolate America through tariff mania and attacking allies and saying he's going to invade Greenland and all kinds of stuff like that. But
you feel that's a messaging he's been given to do on purpose.
Well, I think he's viewed as a tool through which this can be accomplished. In part, I think so. Yeah. In part, I think he's been given this message by people around him. The Greenland thing, for example, was suggested to him apparently by Ronald Lauer, who's president of the World Jewish Congress, the World Zionist Congress. And Larry Fink was apparently the guy who suggested the invaded and seized the Panama Canal. So he was apparently in on that.
And what about Venezuela? Who was in charge? Who told him Venezuela? I don't know that. I mean, they pulled it off, I guess, but
that's more Marco Rubio and his connections.
Rubio? Okay.
Yeah, well,
you must admit there's a drama going on with Trump where he's like, it really does seem like, regardless of who's telling him what or where he's getting his info or his orders or what, he's unabashedly kind of reveling in his power in a kind of crazy way, isn't he? Like these press conferences where he's saying these things and he's talking about, I can just do what I want. Who else could get away with this shit except for me? There is a kind of crazy, too much power.
You have to look at background. You have to look at his background. Trump is from New York. Okay. His father was a real estate tycoon in New York.
Yeah.
Now you can't be a real estate tycoon in New York without being A, mobbed up, and B, Jewed up. Okay. So Trump's father, Fred Trump, was so committed to Israel as a cause that many people thought he was Jewish. All right. But that was purely opportunist. I mean, Trump grew up in the milieu of northeastern Jewish mobsters. That's right. and Italians and all that too. But that's who Trump is. I mean, he's German, but ethnically, but the Jewish and Italian mafia. That's who his role models were. All right.
So he'll say and do anything if it's opportunistic. You're saying it's not an examination. It's not an examination of a psychological profile. You can't say the power's gone to his head or anything. It's just that he's following orders, basically.
Right. And Trump was a protege of Roy Cohn, the gay Jewish mafia lawyer, who died of AIDS back in the 80s, So this is who Trump learned his life lessons from. All right. Now, as far as what Trump actually believes, I get the impression that beyond just himself and his own ego, he doesn't really believe in anything. I think he believes in whoever gave him the most money last told him. It's
I heard he's obsessed with winners, and that people that talk to him.
Totally.
He's obsessed with anybody in sports or anything who's like a winner,
right?
And he obsessively talks with them and how they did it, and he just obsesses over this.
Right. But if you look at his political alliances, all right, you see that he's connected to Zionist interest in a lot of different contexts. I mean, first of all, he even though he's from New York, he also has strong Florida connections as well. All right. Obviously, there's not only a Zionist element to that, but also the Cuban exiles, the Venezuelan exiles, and then Marco Rubio was a senator from Florida. He is Cuban, so he's connected to all that as well. All right. So that Trump's saber rattling against Venezuela and Cuba is rooted in big part in his own connections there, as well as Rubio and the interest behind that. Also, I think some of that is a consolation prize for certain other interests. What I mean by that is the traditional, well, not since the Cold War period, since the 50s, say the 40s and the 50s, the real foundation of the Republican Party was Sun Belt capitalism in the West, the Southwest, the Midwest, which means the defense industry, defense contractors, National Association of Manufacturers, Chamber of Commerce, Texas Oil, agribusiness. That's really what the Republican Party was during, say, the Reagan, Goldwater, even George W. Bush era. Now, Trump has since come along and superseded all that with these sectors of new capital that are behind him, like global finance capital, like Larry Fink, like ultra-Zionists, like Miriam Adelson, like the tech oligarchs, like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. But he still has had to absorb Sunbelt capital into his coalition. And it seems like some of what he does is making certain concessions or throwing bones to those interests. Obviously, the military-industrial complex is the main one. So that's why Trump is proposing record high military budgets, $1.5 trillion or something like that. He's saying to the defense contractors, to Raytheon and all of that, he's saying, don't worry, you're going to get your corporate welfare, And then a lot of the Sun Belt capital, particularly the more medium, lower level capital that you see in the South and the West, Midwest, that are heavily dependent on export markets. His tariffs are having the effect of weakening the value of the dollar internationally, which is great if you have an American business that is dependent on export markets, because your export markets are going to be more profitable. So I think some part of the reason, not the sole reason, but part of the reason for his tariff mania was that it was to enhance the interest of Sunbelt capitalists that are, sort of at the intermediary level within the Republican Party. And in addition, that's having the positive side effect for global finance capital of weakening the United States as a whole internationally. But also the Sunbelt wing of capitalism, the so-called, Goldwater, Reagan conservatives, they tend to be nationalistic. And they tend to be big on dominating Latin America. And Trump is basically reviving gunbelt diplomacy, gunboat diplomacy.
Right. Well, it's pretty crazy how he's taking that plunge into outwardly invading nations like Venezuela and just saying we're going to take their gold and their oil and
Yeah, well, that's how the United States did it,
Excuse me.
Pre-World War. Yeah, prior to the era of the UN and the League of Nations, like pre-World War I, that's how the United States did it in Latin America.
But there was a naked step over into a really aggressive state. We've all sort of gotten used to it in the last few months or whatever it is. But nothing like that was happening before. Ukraine was pretty dodgy already, but this is like a whole new ballgame. I was going to say though, you were saying there about the finance capital wanting to weaken America, but why do they, when they seem to need America to do things like invade Iran and get these things out of their way? Like, you know what I mean?
Well, that's the thing. That's why I was saying that I don't think that they want America to completely collapse. They don't want American unipolar hegemony because they want to penetrate Eurasian markets and the global South and the BRICS and all of that. And that can't work if there's going to be a Cold War with the BRICS. All right. But they don't want America to just become a basket case country and fall apart into a civil war or something, because they do need American power for these kinds of actions.
Well, if warming up to BRICS was so important to them, why would they do the Iran invasion at all then? Because that obviously makes it all very
for Zionism.
So that's a total difference there, because one side wanted to warm up to them and the other side wants to cut them off completely then, because it obviously makes
global finance capital is more than just Zionism. There's a whole coterie of interests that are involved in that. Including Russian connected interest and Chinese connected interest and Saudi connected interests. That's more than just Zionism. But so I think those sectors, and some of those sectors are Zionist as well, but those sectors I think are more concerned with facilitating the transition away from unipolar global hegemony by the United States to a system of, I guess you could call it, managed multipolarity. All right, because they see that as in their long-term interests. Now, the Zionists, the hardline ultra-Zionist types, the Miriam Adelsons, and the people that are, some of the people who are bankrolling Trump directly. Now, those are Israeli nationalists. Those are Kahanists, and they just care about greater Israel or eliminating threats to Israel or perceived threats to Israel. So it's not like everybody has exactly the same goals. There's, I think global finance capital has one set of goals, and there are Zionists embedded in that. But the Zionists in that are more likely to be the type that are more concerned about the diaspora. And then you have the Israeli nationalists, and particularly extreme Israeli nationalists, like Kahanist types, who are more concerned about advancing greater Israel in the here and now. These are the ones that are whispering in Trump's ear to attack Iran and stuff of that nature. Right. Now, there are other interests, though, that are connected to Trump that might benefit from a war with Iran. A military-industrial complex, obviously, they always benefit from war. Texas oil, the same kind of interest that were behind the Bush administration's war in Iraq. I mean, all of that is still there. I think it started to yield to other influences.
You've just been Americans were just kicked out of Iraq for the last. They've retreated out there very recently.
Well, Iraq is aligned with Iran now. It's essentially a satellite of Iran. Well, it's interesting because back when September,
why is that when they're? Am I wrong that Iraq is Sunni? Or what? Am I wrong?
No, Iraq has a majority Shia population.
Right. Okay. Sorry.
And they have the Kurdish minority, and they've got the Sunni minority, and they've got other smaller minorities.
That was it. Okay.
But no, it's interesting because back in 2001, when September 11th happened, when the war in Afghanistan, the American invasion of Afghanistan, was building up, even before that war started, I knew the United States was going to lose in Afghanistan.
Why?
Because no other power that ever tried to occupy that region did.
History,
I mean, the Soviet Union had just tried it for 10 years and it didn't work. The British Empire tried it. Alexander the Great tried it. It didn't work.
Well, frankly, they seem like brutal cunts. I'll tell you one thing. If you hear about a report in Europe of someone like raping and killing randomly, like, I don't know, it feels like very often it's like Afghan immigrants.
Well, the Central Asians can get pretty vicious. Yeah.
The vicious fuckers. Yeah. Like,
But yeah, I mean, I knew that the United States was probably going to lose. I figured we'd have the same experience as the Soviets. We'd be there 10 years and then leave. We ended up staying 20, but I was mostly right. But and then with Iraq, the second Iraq War in 2003, I thought the same thing. I thought that, well, if we dislodge the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, one of two things.
So there was the Ba'athists. That's why Iraq went to war with Iran, because they were Ba'athists, and they they weren't. That's why I thought it was Sunni.
Well, also the Iraq are Arabs. They were Ba'athist Arabs under Saddam Hussein, and the Iranians are Shia Persians. So but I figured that if Saddam Hussein's regime was dislodged, you would get one of two things. You would either get a majority Shia government, which means Iraq would be a satellite of Iran, or the Sunni Takfiris on the ground would start a guerrilla warfare. Well, we ended up getting both. We got ISIS on one hand. We got a Sunni insurgency in Iraq and in Syria through ISIS and other groups like that. And then the Iraqi government itself became a majority Shia government aligned with Iran. So we actually got both. And all of that was entirely predictable. I mean, you didn't have to be some genius of world history or something to understand.
Well, even knowing world history and then trying to calculate the strength of the modern tactical edifice in war, and the machinery, I would have banked on the Americans winning. But I guess it's not. They did. Like, it's like, I saw some example of this. Was it in Afghanistan? They were talking. I think they were talking about. Maybe it was Afghanistan. I don't remember, but they were saying how they won every battle technically, yet won the war. Like, every single battle, they was like, okay, there was a fight and they wiped them out with their helicopters and their their superior firepower. Yet the war overall was still lost just because, again, they're such hard cunts. And
Vietnam was the same way.
Vietnam, that was another one. Yeah, Vietnam was
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, that's what way back in 1990 when the first Gulf War happened with over Kuwait, I thought if the Americans got involved in all that stuff, it would end up being Vietnam in the Middle East. Now, it hasn't been that yet in the sense of the number of American casualties. Arguably, it's been that in the Middle East, geographically. But I do think that if the situation in Iran currently evolves into a land war, it is going to be Vietnam in the Middle East. It's going, and it may even be worse than Vietnam. I mean,
Do you think?
the
Do you
idea.
think that's going to happen? Do you think that's about to happen?
Well, I don't know. I think
Right.
that the ultra Zionists that are behind the government of Israel, and many of whom are embedded in the American government in the Trump administration, I think that if they have their way, yeah, there would be a Vietnam War with Iran. I don't know that Trump and some of his other people really want that. I think they're concerned about how that's going to impact themselves politically, for example, in the United States. I think they're worried about losing. As you mentioned before, Trump likes winners. He doesn't like losers, so he doesn't want to actually lose anything.
Well, he must. So the polls must be killing him right now, though. No.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, he just lies about it. He lies about how popular he is, and he claims the polls are all fake news.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, he may really believe that because he seems to be sun in some ways, but yeah, I don't know how the things are going to go in Iran, but if it escalates into a full land war, then yeah, it's going to be like Vietnam in the Middle East.
So you don't have personal predictions. You don't know. Would you guess that Israel may drop a nuke on Iran if they feel desperate enough?
Potentially, yeah. Potentially, I think if Israel thinks they're backed into a corner and there's no way out, they'll launch what they call the Samson option, which is the idea that if they think they're going to go down, they'll just launch a nuke. They'll take everybody down with them. They threatened that as far back as the Yom Kippur War.
I wonder is it real though? Because they're such fucking lying bastards. Maybe it's not even real. Did they really have that power?
Probably well, no. Back during the Yom Kippur War, Golda Meir was the prime minister of Israel at the time, and she told President Nixon that if the Americans didn't give them the support that they wanted, they would have to use other options, implying they would use their nuclear arsenal. And they actually started giving out signals they were ready to launch nukes. In fact, there's actually a video somewhere online of Jonathan Pollard talking about this. Jonathan Pollard was an Israeli American who was a spy. He spied on the United States for Israel, ended up doing a lot of time in prison in America, but then he was released and he went to Israel, and the Israelis welcomed him as a hero. But there's a recent interview of him talking about that, where he's talking about what Golda Meir did during the Nixon era and saying, yeah, we should just try that again. We'll tell the Americans if they don't give us what we want, we'll just start, using our nukes. And he was giving a precise description of how Golda Meir did it and how they could do it. So yeah, I think that I've always thought that if there was ever actually a nuclear war, the countries that would be most likely to cause it would be one, Israel, and probably India and Pakistan, number two. More so than the Western countries or Europe or China or even the DPRK. And yeah, I still think that. I think the next country to use nukes is probably going to be Israel.
Yeah, so that doesn't sound good. It sounds because right. I mean, I think it's not. If I was to guess the percent chance that they would try to drop a nuke on Iran, but then I wonder too, could Iran take a nuke or two and keep on taking as well? I mean, and maybe.
Well, Japan lost a couple of cities, but they're still around. I mean,
take it, not even surrender. Let's say, not lose the war. Even. I mean, they must be. I'm sure now they're working on their own, getting their own. They must be. I mean, I would guess. Maybe not. I mean, who knows? But I would guess they're working.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure where all that stands.
Yeah. So in terms of predictions, it's very hard to tell, and I guess none of us know, and you're the same as the rest of us. But you do a very excellent, in-depth summation of all the powers at play. You definitely have learned quite a bit from you here. So you think the future for Trump is what? How about that? Can you predict? Would you have a prediction for that?
Well, technically, he's got a little less than 3 years left in his term. That assumes he physically survives it. The indications I see are that his health is not good.
Mm.
There's some indication that he has circulatory problems, some serious health issues. There's indication that he may have early stages Alzheimer's. His father died of Alzheimer's, and
Right.
there's some indication Trump may be receiving treatments for Alzheimer's. So, I mean, I don't know that he'll even live another 3 years, but nowadays, you have some people, including leading conservatives, that are calling on J.D. Vance to use the 25th Amendment against him. Now, I don't know that that's going to happen, or that there's enough support to make that happen. But I don't know what's going to happen to Trump. He seems to be fading. Huh?
Yeah, well, he's acting more and more crazy. JD Vance seems to me kind of a comical character, though. I don't know what the deal is with Vance or what he's supposed to be, or
He
I don't
strikes
know.
me as just a rank opportunist. I think that
Yeah,
J.D. Vance is a rank opportunist, and I think his role in the administration, he's largely a front man for the tech oligarchs. He's a front man for guys like Peter Thiel.
Thiel,
Yeah, and
yeah,
he's also aligned. He's also aligned with the Zionists as well through the NatCons, through people like Yoram Mazani.
oh,
So Vance represents that the tech oligarch Zionist alliance. So Vance is a pure opportunist, which means he may welcome the opportunity to be president.
he might, yeah.
He may. Who knows? He could move against Trump. So,
Oh, he
but
could. Yeah, that's like so. Did Trump is definitely a bit of a sacrificial lamb, and which is odd considering he's been so loyal to his masters, I guess. But
yeah, well, Trump is, like I said, I think he's fading. Like at one point there was talk about Trump trying to run for a third term, which is illegal under the Constitution. But there was this. I used to hear Steve Bannon and people like that, and also Alan Dershowitz and also Miriam Adelson talking about ways they could get around the constitutional limitation on the president to 2 terms. Um, so I was thinking they may try that, or there's also just the idea of trying to cheat their way through in the midterms or in the upcoming presidential election in 28. There are people from the left that are worried about that they're actually going to try to carry out a coup or something like that. So, but Trump himself, though, seems to be fading. He seems to be fading mentally, fading physically. He's increasingly going the Joe Biden direction, I think. So I don't know.
when the Democrats inevitably take over, then what's you feel the direction they'll still pursue the more or less Trump's objectives, or will they sort of ease off? Do you think, or what do you think?
Well, I was saying earlier, I think that the global finance capital, I think that the global ruling class probably wishes to reinstall the Democrats after Trump, just for stabilization purposes. But the question is, what would that involve? And I think probably they're going to bring the Democrats would probably start bringing criminal charges against a lot of veterans of Trump's administration. It's kind of sort of like what they did before with the prosecutions over the election thing in Georgia and the J6. I'm thinking that the Democrats may then move to purge or suppress Trumpism, by bringing charges against some of his people, probably with the support of the global ruling class. They may decide, well, these Trump folks serve their purposes. Now we got to keep them on a short leash. As far as where the Democrats would go, other than that, I don't know. I think that there's going to be a conflict between those that want to toe the neoliberal line and basically have the equivalent of what a Hillary Clinton administration might have been, versus those that want to move leftward and weaponize the left, as like the new shock troops, kind of like what Trump has done with MAGA. What Trump did with MAGA was he sort of dusted off a lot of these dormant traditions in American culture, like or that were always there on the Republican side anyway, but like the low church evangelicals and the very nativist, kind of know nothing types, and the conspiracy theorists, Alex Jones types. Trump brought all that into the mainstream of the Republican Party. And I can see the Democrats countering that by weaponizing the kind of DSA left, like the Zoran Mamdani, AOC, Bernie Sanders. Now, I think the neoliberal oligarchs behind the Democratic Party would object to that, but they may be overridden by global finance capital. It's going to all be dependent on, what the dominant factions of these, ruling class layers think is going to best serve their own interests.
So in a way, there's no way to predict. It's like we'll never know because we have these within even our power structure. There's warring power structures, and it's like whoever comes out dominant at that time between them, and you don't even have a solid.
Well, one of the biggest leftward leaps in American history was under President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, with the New Deal. But the interesting thing is the way that happened was it was actually the Rockefellers that were behind that. When the Great Depression happened, you had radical movements that developed in the United States, like the Communist Party, comparable stuff from the far right, like Father Coughlin and that kind of stuff. Yep. The Rockefellers were trying to prevent a revolution in the United States, like what happened in Germany and Italy and Russia and places like that. So they wanted to reform the system by bringing labor into the system, co-opting labor and bringing it into the system and getting some of the excesses of pre-Depression era capitalism under control. All right, so it was the top layers of the capitalist class in the United States and transatlantic finance capital that were actually behind the New Deal, the Rockefeller types. Whereas it was the more lower levels of capital, like the Midwestern Chamber of Commerce, that were opposed to that. They even tried to organize a coup against Roosevelt. So the New Deal was this weird alliance between the super capitalists and the social democratic type reformers and organized labor, and with more intermediary level capitalism being opposed. And I could see that happening again, because right now we're moving into an economic situation similar to that time, like the Gilded Age, with the huge disparities between social classes.
Well, how will the Strait of Hormuz business? Will that? Do you see that disrupting things majorly? Do you feel they have fail-safes against that? The way it's set up.
I think the cost of that are probably going to be outsourced to the global South. It's the global South.
Really? The whole thing.
It's countries like the Philippines that are going to absorb the cost of that. All right,
seriously. Not even Europe. Not even places like that. No.
Well, it'll hit everywhere somewhat, but I think it's the global South that's going to feel the bulk of that.
Really? Okay.
But so they can. That's an externality that can be, put on the global South. But
is there not risk then of getting war from the global, getting outrage and war from the global South over that? Or
well, what are they going to do about it? I mean, is the Philippines going to invade the United States? It's no. Well, I think that's actually a conflict. I think that's actually a conflict within the ruling class between what I call the ultra-Zionists, who only care about Greater Israel and eliminating Iran and all that, and the others that are more concerned about integration financially with the BRICS and manage multipolarity. I do think that's a conflict. In fact, this is another interesting thing I haven't touched on, but I've seen signals lately that sectors within the national security establishment and the American ruling class and the international ruling class are pushing back against some of the excesses of the hardline Zionists. For instance, within the Pentagon sector, the military, you have realist, officers and military strategists, civilian strategists, who strike me as realizing the Zionist paradigm of Greater Israel and all of that, and war with the entire Middle East for Israel is not in American strategic interests as far as national security. And I think they're probably pushing back on that. Publicly, that would be figures like Colonel Douglas McGregor and Colonel Daniel Davis and Lawrence Wilkerson. But for every public figure like that, you've got others behind the scenes. Then you also, within the more moderate wing of the intelligence services, the CIA. The CIA is not a monolithic entity. There's the CIA has multiple factions, and you've got one that's very Mossad aligned, but you've got another faction that's very anti-Mossad. They view the Mossad as rivals. So the moderate wing of the intelligence services, I think, seems to be pushing back somewhat. For instance, we have a governor here in Virginia that was recently elected. Some people say I'm crazy when I point this out, but we have a governor here that was just recently elected. She is CIA. She's literally CIA. You know, she was CIA and went into politics. She was in Congress and now she's a governor. But I see her as probably someone who is being groomed by a particular sector of the CIA for future national leadership. And she seems to come from the more moderate wing of the CIA. One of her first actions as governor was she appointed a former congressman, a guy named Jim Moran. She appointed him to the board of directors of the largest state university. Now, the interesting thing about that is Jim Moran, when he was in Congress, was a very outspoken critic of the Israel lobby. He was put out of Congress for that. The Israel lobby made him a target. All right. That guy like this is being elevated to a central position in the state university system when one of the first moves the Zionists made after October 11th was to seize control of the universities to suppress the pro-Palestinian protests. And this university I'm referring to, they had that as well. That strikes me as some sort of counter initiative, some sort of, I don't think that's just an accident. I mean, I think that there's some kind of counter Mossad initiative going down there, I suspect.
I have heard something else recently from the CIA. What was it? I can't remember now. Some bit of news I heard that was kind of backing up what you're saying there, that there's some kind of part of it that's kind of reacting against that. I can't remember what it was now.
Well, I think the intelligence services of some of the Gulf countries are involved in this as well. Like now among the Israel firsters, it's common to refer to Tucker Carlson as Qatari Carlson. They say he's an agent of Qatar, but I don't think that's entirely wrong. I think that the SSB, which is the Qatari intelligence services, I suspect that they are conducting counter Mossad psyops in the United States to counter the influence of Mossad. And in fact, another guy that Spanberger, the governor of Virginia, appointed to the same state board of education or university board, is Qatari connected. He was a lobbyist for the Qataris or something. So it seems like there's a counter Mossad formation going on in different places. You mentioned this guy, Professor Zhang, the Chinese guy.
Yeah.
When I first encountered him, I figured he was probably some kind of CCP asset, because why is a guy who supposedly is teaching high school in China doing YouTube videos where he's teaching his classes in perfect English? He speaks broken English, but why is he doing that in English? Why is he not teaching in Mandarin? So I figured this must be some kind of CCP operation. Although the more I've looked into Zhang, the more it seems like he may have connections to American intelligence. I know he's actually been accused of being a CIA operative, including by the Chinese, apparently. But the catch there is I know Americans who have this view that the Chinese have infiltrated the CIA, and I've been somewhat hesitant to embrace that, because I tend to think, if anything, it's the opposite. The Americans tend to have penetrated the Chinese intelligence services, but there may be some kind of joint operation between the counter Mossad wing of CIA going on in collusion with Chinese intelligence, because both are concerned that of the destabilization effect that the ultra-Zionists are having on the Middle East. China does not want the Middle East to be plunged into total chaos. They have a lot of trade activities and developmental activities going on there, like BRI, for example. And so if the moderate wing of CIA is concerned about the Mossad influence in the United States, and the Chinese are likewise concerned, it's possible they may have some kind of joint operation going on, in part because that wing of the CIA was also connected to the Rockefeller wing of the American ruling class, which was always very accommodating to the Chinese. that wing of the American ruling class really welcomed Nixon's China opening back in the 70s. So there may be some kind of counter-Zionist, joint CIA, joint Chinese project going on. And some guy like Zhang may be some kind of, Professor Zhang may be some kind of psyop for that purpose. I don't know. Because he's definitely a weird phenomenon. So who knows what's going on.
Yeah, sudden weird. But he did sound like he had a very accurate and a sensible prediction of how things are going to play out and what Iran can do. But again, it culminated in sort of blaming it all on the Freemasons and these bizarre theories.
Well, I think that's intended for American audiences. I mean,
nobody even talks about shit like that anymore, really, do they? I mean, Illuminati and stuff like that's, maybe.
Zhang, I think, is intended for American audiences that are mostly on the far right and really.
He's talking about UFOs and demons if he wants to.
Well, he
needs to get with the current program on that.
That's who's into that stuff. You have these cultural undercurrents on the American far right that embrace every conspiracy theory there is. These are the people who.
Well, they love demons and they love UFOs.
They're into demons. They're into UFOs. They're into the Illuminati. And bringing the Zionists and the Jews and all into that is part of that as well. So it seems like he's orienting himself towards that audience. That's the audience he's trying to cultivate. The question is why, and I suspect the purpose of that is similar to what Carlson is doing, although Carlson may be colluding with either American intelligence or Qatari intelligence or both.
You think so? I like Tucker. I always thought Tucker was
funny too. I like him somewhat. I mean, he's kind of nutty at times, but I like him, But
sometimes he's nutty. He's done a bit of that demon UFO stuff too. But
yeah. Well, he's Christian, but I think that maybe
you're biased against the Christians.
Yeah. Well, I'm biased against the supernatural, I guess, but some of these people may be psyops coming from some different directions. I think for the purpose of moving the American right wing away from Zionism. Carlson may be a psyop coming from one direction, either the American deep state or the Qataris or some collusion between the two. I would guess that. And then Zhang may be, oriented towards the same sector, some sort of CIA, China, CCP collusion. It's
well, when there's so many groups, where's the room for your anarchist freedoms, or if every single thing?
That's a good question. That's a very good question.
There's so many different groups and subgroups, and they're all in disposition and opposition, and everyone's controlling some angle of the narrative of and everyone's fighting over a piece of this group and that group. I don't know. Fuck. It's great.
Yeah. Well, that's a somewhat separate question, but that's those fight battles tend to come from the bottom up. Going back to Spartacus. But it seems like there are some counter-Zionist initiatives going on. The interesting thing about Russia and China, as far as the Iran war, is that they're kind of in the middle, because on one hand, it's in the strategic interest of both Russia and China for America to get bogged down in a useless war in the Middle East, because that weakens the United States overall, which hastens the transition to multipolarity, which strengthens the power of the Russians and the Chinese. On the other hand, they don't want that region to just fall into complete chaos more than it already is. They don't like Tekfiri insurgencies in their backyard. They don't want just an amalgam of failed states in West Asia, for economic as well as security reasons. So it seems to me that the strategy that Russians and Chinese are taking, and I think this is correct from their vantage point, is they're supporting Iran to the degree to maintain Iran as something that's a thorn in the side to the Americans. But at the same time, they like the idea of the Americans getting bogged down in a war in the region. It's kind of like contain the war, but let the Americans get sunk in this quicksand. That's very much in the strategic interest. I mean, if I were a national security advisor to President Xi or President Putin, that's what I would tell them. I'd say, let the Americans dig themselves in a hole, but contain it from spreading into Central Asia.
Certainly it helps Russia with the Ukraine war.
Right. Oh, totally. I mean, because resources are being diverted from Ukraine to the Middle East, and also in East Asia. From resources are, in fact, the China hawks, the wing.
Oh, they took them all out of. They took their stuff out of South Korea, was it? Yeah.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
that,
The wing of American politics that are China hawks. They're upset about that. They're saying, "Hey, wait a minute. What about the Chinese?"
Yeah. Oh, there's so many things. Someone made a comment here. I just want to say Ian Paisley's. They said, Mr. Liam Griffin said Ian Paisley's a Free Presbyterian Church is similar to United Reformed Church. I don't know if you know them. I don't know.
Well, that's in the Calvinist tradition. Yeah, I knew he was
Calvinist. Okay,
basically something like that. But yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to get that before I forgot it. And someone else said E. Michael Jones speculates that Trump has syphilis. And how it wrecks them. I don't know. There's no need to speculate syphilis. His father, I just said his father had Alzheimer's, so it's more likely that. No?
Yeah. I'd say Alzheimer's is more likely, but
Yeah. I mean, maybe syphilis. I mean, certainly he's had. I mean, he's been famous for a long time. He could have something like syphilis, I guess.
Yeah.
He did.
Well, he once said that Trump once said on the Howard Stern show that his own personal Vietnam was having sex without condoms during the AIDS epidemic in the 80s. So maybe he just got syphilis instead.
His own personal Vietnam. Only he would say something. I will miss some of his retarded ego shit. It's pretty funny. When he's gone, he's going to be gone soon, I think. Anyways,
yeah.
But listen, I think I've kept you for like 2 hours at least. Is it? Something
yeah.
Like where's it tell me the time? 2 hours. Yeah. So I think we covered it. Is there anything else? Like, anything we missed there, or what? I think we got.
We've pretty much gone through all the world's problems.
Excuse me, all the world's problems. Yeah, exactly. I mean, everything. We encompassed a lot of stuff there. Right. And as usual, yes, very in depth, and you really do stay on top of your information. That's for sure. And I really do appreciate your unique and in-depth view of these things.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you informed me on many things I didn't know about before there. So thanks again, Keith. And I guess we'll keep seeing what's going to happen. We're living in dramatic times here.
For real.
And it's all culminating in something or other. But like, I do believe you're right, and you really did bring to the front of my mind the fact that there's so many different even factions within these other factions, and there's these. How do you keep track of all this shit? I mean, you seem to have been doing it somehow. But
I just have a lot of different channels of information open. One difference between my approach and what a lot of people's approaches seem to be is that I don't just get information from singular sources that I already agree with or whatever, like literally I have information coming to me from all across the cultural and political spectrum, including stuff that's very mainstream and establishmentarian, all the way over to stuff way, way, way out on the fringes, and if you try to get that kind of panoramic view, you can get a somewhat comprehensive picture of what's going on. Not completely so, but
that's your value that's the value of your anarchist belief there, because you don't have those biases trying to confirm. You seem to be sort of you're willing to go into any camp because that's your rock bottom belief is kind of you're going to do your own thing, and
there you go.
Right. So no, that's good. Yeah, because a lot of information there. Very, very, very interesting. Yeah. So is Trump getting fired as CEO of McWorld? Yes, more than likely he is.
Well, the United States as a state, I think, is getting fired as CEO.
The United States, that's right. The United States on the whole.
His way out. Yeah, Trump's on his way out. But
you did say sort of conflictingly that they did want to keep the U.S. going as well, or am I?
They don't want the United States to completely fall into chaos. No, they want to maintain the United States for stabilization purposes and also as a weapon, for discipline of the global South. But they don't. But
they'll take the crown away and put the crown somewhere else. Is what you're saying. Yeah.
Or spread the crowns out, among multiple kings. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's it then. There we go. So yes. So we'll see what happens. Maybe you'll be right. And I'll have you on again afterwards, and we'll see if it came to pass that way or what happened. There'll be some other drama. So thanks a lot, Keith. I better go in now.
All right.
Everybody, have a good night. Thanks a lot. Good stuff.
Later.
Good night.